Hey, it's Emily, your favorite PodRocket producer. Did you know that LogRocket has a TikTok now? You can catch up on all the interview clips from this show, watch UX tutorials, and get more great content from LogRocket. You can check out the LogRocket TikTok today at log.rocket. See you on TikTok.
Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. LogRocket provides AI-first session replay with analytics which surface UX and technical issues impacting user experiences. Start understanding when your users are struggling and try for free at logrocket.com today. My name is Paul, and joined with me is Sia Karamalegos. She is a performance engineer, Google developer expert, web developer all around, and most notably an expert in web technologies and web performance, which is what we're going to be talking about today. In fact, the name of the talk that we are going to be reminiscing on is Sia's talk for You're Probably Doing Web Performance Wrong. What a title, Sia. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to have this conversation with you and excited to dig into what we're doing wrong, because I'd love to know.
Yeah, it was a bit of a clickbaity title. I think now I call it something about it's time to ditch Lighthouse 100. But yeah, generally, there's some things you should consider now if you're newer to web performance or never really thought of yourself as that great at it yet.
You mentioned Lighthouse. Is Lighthouse the go-to tool that you see 99% of people going for? Is that kind of the basis of truth that we're going to set forth off on our combo here?
Right. It has been. And it's not to say that Lighthouse is bad. It's actually brought a lot of great awareness about web performance and also links out to a lot of great topic about how to improve particular issues. But it's usually not the first thing you want to reach out for. Because if you do reach out for it first, you might end up turning a lot of time and not getting like the impact that you really wanted.
I assume we're going to be talking about where that misaligns and how we can remedy that. Little spoiler alert for our listeners. We're going to be talking about actual user activity, which is funny because the Primogene, he came out with a video and it was interesting. It was titled, I only test in production. And people were like, what do you mean you only test in production? Don't you just do unit tests? And I think that this has a similar set of connotations and like mental notes to take. So can you explain the difference from these two categories of the Lighthouse, we can call it like lab testing, and what we're going to be talking about today, stuff with real users. Maybe it's not production, right? But it's up that vein of something's real.
Lab testing is probably what you're used to doing with web performance. It's your Lighthouse. It's your dev tools, like when you open up the network tab and the performance tab. If you use web page tests or other tools, most of that is what's called lab testing. It's usually you're doing a single run and then seeing what changes. Usually we're checking like what changes or like what's going on in that single run. You're usually running it like on your computer or like on your own device and on your own network. The problem with that is that it's only that single run. So you're going to miss a lot of the real bottlenecks that other people have because they're also on different devices and different networks. And especially considering that we're developers, we probably have the higher end devices and networks, which are not really representative of real user experience. And just to pause here, we don't care about performance for performance sake. Like I have literally zero cares about what your Lighthouse score is. I don't actually reach for Lighthouse 100. I'll still use Lighthouse, but for particular features, not for the scores themselves. Lab testing is great for debugging, but like I said, it can turn you into the wrong direction. So a better method is to start with what we call real user monitoring, or RUM for short. And this is, we are gathering data from real user interactions on our web pages. Because the only reason why we care about web performance is because it impacts user experience. So if a user has a frustratingly slow experience, or things are moving around on the page and they can't click the button because it just moved, or they're trying to click a button and nothing is happening, and so they start rage clicking. So these are the things that make people leave your website. And so you'll get bounces and lower conversions. So we care about web performance so that we can improve this user experience. But we don't know, we might be fixing the wrong thing unless we're actually tracking what real users are experiencing. RUM data, or real user data, is when we measure what's going on with those experiences. So literally, say you have 1,000 page views, we're actually going to measure what happened in those actual page views and then aggregate that data and send it back to you, which I think LogRocket does, but there's also a lot of providers, and there's some public data sets where you can find information about this too. If you've ever run, for example, page speed insights, which is one way that people get Lighthouse scores, if your website has enough traffic, it's probably in what's called the Chrome User Experience Report. And this is the publicly available data set of web performance coming from Chrome users only. You can find out more on their website about it, but there's a thing that will pop up at the top of page speed insights. And I think they call it field data or I forgot what they call it. They keep changing the labels for it, but there's this little box at the top it will give you your core web vitals, which we'll probably talk about at some point in here, and a few extra metrics. So I think it gives you 5 metrics at the moment. And that data is the real user data, and you can get it from several different places, but it allows us to see, like, with these real users, where are the big problems? And it can vary too, of course, by page type. For example, a lot of times it varies by page type, by device. So maybe you have a problem with layout shift on desktop, but not mobile, or your time to first byte is really slow, but it's because in certain regions, your server's too far. So you're never going to get this kind of information from Lighthouse. You're only going to get debugging. Real user data allows you to look at the big picture and then say, okay, now what are my biggest problems? And let me attack those first. So it allows you to prioritize your work and get the biggest bang for the buck earlier on in your performance optimization.
Anytime we're talking about like new paradigm, a new way to do things, the 2 questions are like, is there prior art and how do I start? So you mentioned Core Web Vitals. I think that's a great way to start talking about the prior art, because RUM at its core, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's not inherently different from Core Web Vitals. It's just a different way that we're collecting the data, and we could have a broader spray of what we can extract from those observations of real user monitoring.
Sure. So real user monitoring is just the method of collecting data from real users. It doesn't tell you which metrics. There are a ton of metrics, and there's been an alphabet soup of performance metrics over the years that you've probably heard. Usually they're like 3-letter acronyms or 4-letter acronyms like TTFP, FCP, LCP. The Core Web Vitals are just a group of metrics that Google or specifically Chrome has promoted that represent what they think of as a good representation of web performance for users. They are focused on user experience. So largest contentful paint is when is the largest item on the screen rendered, because that helps the user perceive that the page has loaded. Cumulative layout shift is like how much that content is moving around on the page unexpectedly. And then interaction to next paint is how long does it take for the web page to respond to user input? And is that a long time? Because then it will feel laggy. So Core Web Vitals are literally just like a brand name for a group of metrics that Google thinks is important. And most of the web performance community has latched on, because we do think that it's important to focus on user experience. However, when it comes to monitoring, and actually both real user monitoring and lab testing, there's a lot more metrics we look at because they can help us debug. But they're put on a pedestal as, oh, hey, these are probably the most important, but you still want to track some of these other metrics because they'll help you debug what's going on with that.
What underdog metric is your favorite?
Probably first contentful paint. It's by underdog, I'm assuming you mean not in the Core Web Vitals.
Not in the Core Web Vitals, yes.
Yeah, because to be honest, largest contentful paint, which is one of the Core Vitals, is probably the hardest metric to optimize. But what's cool is both time to first byte and first contentful paint are lead up metrics to it. There are actually sub-metrics for LCP that we've been calling the LCP subparts, but a lot of times you might not have that data in whatever data you're looking at. Most the time you have access to time to first byte and first contentful paint. And I like first contentful paint because a lot of times time to first byte is not the reason why you have slow performance. If you have bad time to first byte, then you will definitely have bad performance because you can't ever beat your first step. It's essentially like the first step. It's that time from request to when the server first responds, right? So that's your first step in a web page journey. First contentful paint is like, when does the first thing on the screen show up? And that can be a really good indicator if you look at the difference in the numbers between time to first byte, first contentful paint, and largest contentful paint. If you have a big gap between time to first byte and first contentful paint, you probably have a lot of render blocking resources. So it starts giving me clues about what's going on. But if you only looked at largest contentful paint, you would have no idea if it was a server issue or if it was render blocking issue or just something on the front end, lazy loading your image or something.
That's super interesting. So and also as a user, if I see something being painted, any feedback is good feedback. I like asking about things other than Core Web Vitals because here on PodRocket, we do a fair number of web performance podcasts. Their listeners might say, oh, yeah, Core Web Vitals, here we go again. Yes. And as you said, it's important. I love talking about them, but it's really awesome to hear from you, somebody that's been looking at the whole picture, what other things could be there. And again, just highlighting RUM is the way you're collecting the data to do this stuff. You could do it in the lab. You could get your Lighthouse scores and everything. The thing you're carrying forth here and teaching us all is RUM is way more valuable than we perhaps give it credence for.
Yeah, or it's your first step. And then once you have those high level clues, you can dig down deeper. And then that's when you reach for your lab tools. I personally don't use Lighthouse as much, but I'll use network and performance tabs and dev tools and web page tests a lot. But Lighthouse does have a few features that I like, but it's just a lot of times it will redirect you to things that are maybe not going to, there'll be a lot of work and not a lot of impact, even though theoretically, based on the algorithm, it'll show that.
Could you talk to me a little bit about that? What is a red herring that people sometimes fish out of the pond, stemming from Lighthouse?
Yeah, it does vary a lot. And we have to remember Lighthouse is an algorithm, right? It's looking at data. It's not a human. It's not AI because it was like pre-AI, although Google is investing in more and more in AI stuff. And I will say, be careful with some of the suggestions because they're starting to put it in dev tools. And we've already seen it like misdirecting some web performance suggestions. And I think this part of the problem is a lot of the content out there. There's just so much content, right? I'm not going to talk about like the whole, I don't know how you feel about bad words on here, like the institutification of the web, but there's a lot of like bad content because a lot of people didn't fully understand. So one person will say, optimize your images, and then everyone else says, optimize your images. So now like the body of the web seems to suggest that optimizing your images is important. And I think a lot of other web performance experts think that, yeah, you want to make sure you're not loading a 7 megabyte image. But a lot of the times, like image optimization is a micro optimization. It's not usually why you have poor web performance. We've gotten past the stage where people aren't usually not loading like the multi-megabyte image anymore. It's usually like loading priorities and other things. And so one thing is I do think, although I haven't looked at the tips lately, a lot of times Lighthouse will overemphasize image sizes. And unless you're way far off, it's probably not going to help you a lot. But it also doesn't always catch on to anti-patterns well. So I mentioned lazy loading the largest contentful paint image. So lazy loading is good, but you only want to do it below the fold. For a long time though, it might catch if you use native lazy loading where you have an image tag and you put loading equals lazy on it, but it would not catch all the patterns that we used before native lazy loading, which are still out there because we have a lot of legacy code. So if you're using, for example, the lazy sizes NPM package for lazy loading your images, it won't catch that. And so your image is coming late, but you don't know that's actually the number one issue on your page because Lighthouse didn't catch it correctly. And so it will probably tell you you need to optimize the size of that image, but that's not going to give you that half a second delay back that you got because you lazy loaded it rather than loading it correctly.
And I can understand why that's hard to sniff out because like the breadth of the different plugins, packages, paradigms, it needs to know all of that.
Yeah, it's too much. Like in the front end, especially, I feel like we have to know too many things now, right? Like you need to know your core languages, like your JavaScript, your HTML, your CSS, your TypeScript, your framework, like whatever you're working in. You need to know all of that. Plus, you need to know web performance. Plus, you need to know accessibility. Plus, you need to know SEO. Like you need to know all of these things. And it is hard to be an expert at all those things.
And like you said, sifting through 15 to 20 years of questionable quality, depending where in the timeline that trained content for the AI is helping you out, because it doesn't matter if you use the public content that OpenAI trained on or the DeepSeek content that they're claiming they stole their stolen stuff. Oh my gosh, so sad. What are we going to do? Anyway, could you talk to me a little bit like how people start like remedying this? I'm sure people, I load my images. Maybe I'm not even using a CDN. These are no-brainers. Maybe things about the event loop. What sort of things do you notice with or not event loop, the main process, the main JavaScript process that people maybe miss from the Lighthouse side in terms of...
So the other thing, this actually brings up a good point. So the other issue with lab testing is we're usually doing it just on page load, but at least two of the Core Web Vitals metrics are not only about page load experience. LCP or loading speed is about page load experience. And then there's this other thing about soft navigations for spa apps, but we'll leave that to the side because that's a whole other issue that they're still developing out. But both CLS, the layout shift metric, and IMP are actually for the full page experience. Like it's not just page load. And most lab testing you're usually doing on page load, or you're manually trying to mimic a user process that you're recording, like in the performance tab or something like that. And real user metrics can help you understand that full user experience because usually we're not catching them. Lighthouse is not going to tell you why you're failing your IMP because it is a real user metric only. You have to use proxies for it. So total blocking time is a metric that you can measure on a lab test. And it just means how long the main thread was blocked due to other JavaScript running or like long running tasks and things like that, which it can be correlated to IMP, but it is not actually IMP. And of course, you have the rest of the user experience throughout that whole page session. Did that help answer?
No, that's helpful. I think a follow-up question I would then have is, let's say somebody finds himself in this realization that there is some blocking main thread stuff happening. Where do you find people going next? Is it straight to the inspector in Chrome? Are they using something like Burp Suite to profile things? Like what's going on?
With IMP specifically, you wouldn't necessarily know that it's because you have long tasks on the main thread. That's like an audit that would come from Lighthouse. What you might have is like a failing IMP score. So there are subparts to a lot of these metrics. And there's also, so IMP is one set of performance APIs, but there's also long animation frames or LOAF for short. It looks like loaf, like a loaf of bread. And IMP together, if you're measuring and collecting data on some of those subparts, you can get even better. So you might know which element are they clicking that's then triggering the long task or a long animation frame or a poor IMP. And which script is it coming from? So then you can drill down more and try to figure out like what interaction is actually causing this. Because that's the problem. We're just guessing if we're testing it ourselves. But then once you know what that interaction is, I would say like the biggest tool to reach for is probably the performance tab in DevTools, because then you can isolate that interaction, run it yourself, record it, just that interaction, and then look at what's going on in the main thread. And so a big part of web performance is learning how to use the tools. And I know the performance is quite
They had a recent update that makes it way more palpable.
Yeah. Actually, they've been doing a lot of work improving DevTools. I don't like the AI stuff that they're adding, but a lot of the other stuff is super strong. And they're actually starting to pull in your real user data from the Chrome User Experience Report. Of course, that data is limited because it's not going to give you as many of the cuts as you want. But yeah, so you're probably going to reach for that. So remember, Google created these Core Web Vitals. They also are the main ones behind they also developed LOAF. And their documentation on web.dev is a good starting point for, hey, I have this problem now with IMP. What are some of the common issues or ways I can improve it? And they try to have a lot of use cases. If you're struggling, they're actually quite open to questions and feedback too. So yeah.
I thought your comment of AI is interesting because anytime here on PodRocket, we can get some opinion or commentary that is slightly off the straight line of, yeah, AI. It's always interesting. And this is one of those times where we've talked about the cruft of the past 15 to 20 years of varying quality. We've talked about the breadth of what you need to know today. How do you see AI continuing in this domain that they're pushing it into? Do you think it has credence to continue being developed in here? What warnings would you give people when reaching for it?
So I'll just be open. I'm more of an AI skeptic, but I think it's also because the types of problems I work on are not necessarily well suited to it yet. I don't have to write a lot of boilerplate code and things like that. I have to go in and figure out what's wrong. And actually, someone I was talking to yesterday said the nature of web performance is usually we're already going in there and fixing what a human thought would be best based on Lighthouse. And so the inshitification of the web pre-AI was about people trying to optimized for keywords in Google search, right? So there's a lot of junk content that was already copied. It's just now we can do it faster with more. So that already existed before. And so we're usually coming in and already fixing what what would now be a hallucination with AI. And so for specific web performance debugging, I think it's harder. I do think Chrome team is trying in dev tools, but it's also leading to bad advice. And so I'm worried about that. I do think there might be a role more for your everyday developer that is not necessarily focused on web performance. I'm a different user type than your everyday developer that's just trying to push features out the door. So maybe AI can help them code better so they don't have these issues in the first place. But a lot of times that's also just, hey, are our frameworks and starter apps and things like that, are they using best practices? So that's what I think of. If you can start with best practices, then you have less to fix later on, which is nice.
If you had the ability to look at how people are treating these performance metrics and you can make your own, is there like your own core web vitals? Is there a sort of like addition to the field that you would want to change of something that's a status quo that you don't feel? Lighthouse, sure, super broad, but specifically.
No, actually, there's a lot of cool metrics that are out there too that we don't talk about much, or cool browser APIs. Like the element timing API is really cool because sometimes, this is what I forgot to mention earlier. So the core web vitals are important, but sometimes what's triggering LCP is not necessarily the most important content on your page. So it might be better to measure that element timing if you're focused on user experience. You still want the good core web vital scores because they can impact your search rankings, but you want to optimize more for user experience. So look at those things. But a lot of the APIs exist. I guess my big wish is that, so for now, a lot of these metrics are only on Chromium browsers. And then Firefox has added LCP. I forgot what they are, what on the other metrics where they're at, but I think they had some interest in the others. So my biggest wish is that WebKit or Safari would actually get on board with adding web performance metrics, because especially in the US and Canada, where we have a high market share of iPhones, we have no idea what's going on. And there's some indications based on some other metrics that we've seen that even though iPhones generally have really high-end processors and usually people are on faster networks, that they actually might have some issues, for example, with like higher rage clicks. So there's certain things we can measure even if we don't have these metrics. And so we really want that visibility into WebKit, because then we can also help optimize user experience on WebKit as well. Whereas now we just can't. We just have to assume that if we're optimizing Chrome, Edge, and Firefox, that hopefully it's good on Safari too.
I would love it if people just choose not to use the web apps and go to my tightly controlled app store where I take a 30% rate.
Well, that's why we think they haven't done it, but yes.
All right, we're running up on time here, Sia, but I would love to close this with, if somebody is listening to this podcast that we did today and they say, RUM sounds good, I want to take real user data and I want to figure out how to use these predetermined metrics, maybe it's core, maybe it's some of the other things that you talked about, such as like the first paint. What's the first step? Is it reaching for a really expensive tool? Is it just looking at your logs and putting them through some sort of like log ingestion? How do you recommend folks get started with RUM today?
Yeah, you can't just do a log ingestion. You actually have to specifically measure these things. Your first step, which you can do if your website has enough traffic, just check, like you can run pagespeed.web.dev and see if you have data at the top of the page. That's the field data. That'll give you a starting idea. There's some other tools that are actually really great for looking at crux data and breaking it down, but you still don't have all the metrics. After that, you have a few options. If you already have a tool, if you're using, for example, like LogRocket on something else, I did look at your website and you do have the ability to add front-end web performance measurements. So if you're already using a tool, maybe your current tool already has it. There's a lot of other providers you can also sign on with, SpeedCurve, DebugBear, and some others, RumVision and Caliber. And then you can also roll your own. So there's the Web Vitals NPM package, which is maintained by Chrome. And so it's a way that you can get some code to start with, and they add a lot of features into it. But then, of course, you're going to have to do the data collection, saving, processing, and charting yourself. So that's a lot of work, whereas some of these providers can do that, but you'll have to pay a fee. So it's depending on what works for you. I will say also, I don't know if this is going to be a question coming up, but you can also reach out for help. Like, I don't expect all web developers to understand all parts of performance. That's why people like me exist. And there's some other freelancers in this space as well. Like, just reach out to us. We're happy to help folks. It's also nice when we partner with people because then we can just help you with your specific issues rather than you having to learn everything. And then also once we see your code patterns, we can help train you. Oh, hey, don't do this in the future, do this other thing. And so you can learn that way as well.
Any open source things or frameworks that you've seen come out that help you run your own rum stack?
Yeah, I would say that Web Vitals NPM package. Yeah, so that's the one that you can take. And I think they're going to hopefully come out with more guides on like doing the rest of the data pipeline because that's really the hard part.
That is the hard part.
It's not like you're just adding some script and like doing one thing. There's a whole lot of other stuff. You can collect the data, but then you got to do things with the data.
It's funny because when you like collect the data, anybody who's like at the PM level goes, wow, okay, we're like halfway there and you're like, we just got started. Yeah. This was super enriching for me. I loved this podcast because I had never heard of the term rum before, if I'm being honest. And it's also refreshing to hear a way that you can put what you've built through the paces that's outside of the Lighthouse echo chamber. Because there's a lot of misdirection. I myself can feel camaraderie in what you've said about what do I do now?
And it got worse. Too. It's not your fault. That is just what happened.
And again, so useful. We're not like dinging Lighthouse at all. It's nice to have additional color and clarity of like additional steps you can take. So really appreciate your time coming on. Before we started the recording for this podcast, you mentioned you have a website where people can go to. What was the name of that one?
Oh yeah, it's Sia.codes. So you don't have to spell my last name. I grabbed that domain name real fast when it came out.
And that's Sia, SIA.
Yeah.
.codes, right?
I have some other resources too. Like for Shopify sites, I have this themevitals.com, which actually shows real user data by Shopify theme using the Chrome user experience report. But yeah.
Do you blog anywhere on the X Twitter?
So I am on Blue Sky and Mastodon, but actually on Sia.codes, I have a blog. And so I'm a big proponent of the indie web. So I like to own my own content, except my posts. Those I feel like are ephemeral and I'll just delete them at some point. But all my socials are on there. So if you're trying to find me, just go to Sia.codes and you'll find whatever's the latest.
The latest and greatest of Sia. Thanks again for your time. It's been a pleasure. And hopefully we'll have you again on soon to see what's new with rum.